Hey, how's it going? It is Mythos, and usually my videos on here are quite short, cut up, more fast paced, 5 or 10 minutes just to try and get that information out there. But a lot of people say I wish they were longer. So I thought, hey, why don't we just have a more chilled out video today? And what we're going to be talking about is a quiet town in Northumberland, northeast England called Hexham. And what happened one day on this old council estate in this ordinary garden. Some boys unearthed something far from ordinary. What began as a child's innocent dig for treasures turned into a nightmare that would haunt a family, their neighbours as well, and the entire community for years to come. These two small stone heads, unsettling in their crude carvings and inexplicable origins, would set off a chain of terrifying events that no one could have predicted. Strange footsteps echoing through empty rooms, cold drafts sweeping through the house, and most chilling of all, sightings of a creature no one could explain, a werewolf. As the Hexham Heads made their way from one owner to another, their eerie influence spread, leaving a trail of fear and even more questions. What had these ancient artifacts awakened? And why did the walls between this quiet town and an ancient terror seem to grow thinner with each passing day? Now, although these do look like the Hexham Heads, I've actually recreated these on the computer, turned them into 3D prints so they are replicas. I've painted them up to look like stone, and in my opinion, they don't look too bad. I think they're going to work quite well for the visuals of this story. And if you like this story, and you would love to get your hands on some Hexham Heads as well, perhaps for your display shelf at home like what I've got in the background here, I will tell you how to win your very own pair of Hexham Heads at the end of the story. So let's dive into this and take a look at the terrifying mystery that actually still lingers today. So the Hexham Heads were discovered by two young brothers, Colin and Leslie Robson, while the boys were engaging in their favourite pastime, digging through the garden soil in the search of interesting rocks and artefacts. They'd often unearthed bits of pottery, old coins and trinkets, but this time their spades struck something different. The heads, each the size of around about a fist, were crudely carved and bore distinctive facial features. Their exact origins remain unknown though as we'll get to, some theorists suggest they could be Celtic relics. One of the brothers, Colin, was the first to find one of the heads, brushing away the dirt to reveal its round shape and peculiar facial carvings. Excitedly, he called his brother over, and together they continued digging, uncovering the second head just a few feet away from the first. The boys, of course, as you could imagine, were fascinated by their find. What were these strange round stone heads with weird facial carvings in them? As they were turning the heads over, inspecting them in their hands, believing them to be ancient relics or possibly even lucky charms, the boys brought the heads into their home. At first they treated them as toys, rolling them across the floor and using them in imaginative games. If only they knew what was to come, right? I think they probably would have left them in the garden. Their parents, however, were unsettled by the strange appearance of the artifacts and placed them on the shelf for safekeeping, intending to investigate their origins further. The thing was though, almost immediately after bringing the heads inside, the Robson family noticed strange occurrences. The heads seemed to move on their own, sometimes looking one way on the night, and then by morning they would be looking the other way, but sometimes even appearing in different places where they'd been left. Now that is weird. You would probably think it was just the boys messing around, wouldn't you? But the boys would wake up to find them be repositioned as well. Sometimes on the floor, knocked off the shelf, or sometimes even on a different shelf. They all were seemingly unsettled by what was going on. And so would I, because that is odd. What is going on? I mean, okay, if the things were maybe on the floor, that could have fell off somehow. I mean, after all, they were quite round and funny shaped. Did they roll off the shelf and land on the floor? But them spinning around to face a different direction, or even on a different shelf entirely, that is pretty odd. But then, the family reported poltergeist activity. They heard unexplained footsteps, shuffling sounds, and occasional knocking noises throughout the house. At times, a cold sensation would sweep through the rooms, unnerving the household members. And to top it off, the worst of all, it got to the point where even bottles were being thrown by invisible forces. Oh my gosh, I think that is the time where I would probably make my move. Get out of that house. Notably, the disturbances were not confined to the Robson household. As you can see, the next door neighbours, whose house was only separated by a brick wall, also reported strange activity. And when I was here getting this footage, I would have loved to have gone inside, called out for any spirits that might possibly be there. As you see in the UK, a lot of people go into abandoned homes to get footage, but I think this was just completely locked up and is for sale. I think it was only around £100,000 or something, which is still a lot of money, but you see people, don't you, buying these houses to turn them into haunted houses where people can come and investigate. Like probably the most famous one in the UK, 30 East Drive. I mean, hey, if I had the money, I probably would buy that place and rent it out to investigators. And further you get into the story, you'll probably figure out why that would be interesting to do so. So the neighbours who were living next door, which is one house really, they were of course initially skeptical. But they began to feel the same oppressive atmosphere that had taken hold of the Robson home. Some had even claimed to see shadowy figures in their peripheral vision and hearing whispers in the night. The eerie events soon created a deep fear that spread just beyond one household, leading to growing speculation that something unnatural had been unleashed. One of the most chilling incidents happened to the next door neighbours. The son Brian woke up terrified, claiming something was pulling at his hair. His mother Ellen, of course, tried to reassure him that everything was okay and it was just a dream. To make sure he was okay, she just decided it would be easier to stay in the room with him and sleep there. As Ellen was laying there with Brian though, she heard a strange noise, almost like some movement. That of course wasn't her son because she was lying next to him. She looked up as she thought someone, maybe in the house, broke in and was entering the room. And she was right, besides it being someone. She screamed in terror as she seen a horrific creature enter the room and was actually reaching for her. Her screams seemed to startle it and it ran out of the room on all fours. Imagine that! What on earth would you do in that situation? Of course, the thing there was, she was in bed, she was going to sleep. We've heard many stories start like that, haven't we? She later described the beast as half human and half sheep. Very odd indeed. You could even say a were-sheep. And the thing is with that, what's that going to do? I can't imagine that would be pretty scary, right? Even though before you mentioned the word sheep, it kind of sounds it. But what do you think a sheep's going to do? Nibble at your toes while they're hanging out of the bottom of the bed? At least that's what I thought until I started researching this story and I pulled up a supposed image that someone had created of this were-sheep. Then I started to think, okay, it might be a little bit more scary than I originally thought. And plus, the odd thing is that there's actually an old local folktale about a sheep girl called Bella Sheephead. A girl who adored her beloved lamb, and unfortunately the lamb was torn apart by a hungry fox, only to be discovered by Bella. Poor Bella, finding her pet sheep in pieces. You've got to feel sorry for her, and of course finding the lamb like that, it's time to bury it, right? But no, she drank its blood. As you do. Totally normal, right? The next full moon, Bella transformed into a were-sheep with a deep craving for blood. She slaughtered the local herds on the farmlands but eventually gained the taste for human blood. Was this just some old local folktale? Was it that story playing on her mind? And was it something she dreamt up while being half asleep? Or did Ellen really see this beast? Either way, by all of these frightening occurrences going on between the neighbours, the family asked the council to rehouse them, and they did. They moved out, and of course they rid themselves of these heads as well, passing them on to Betty Gibson for safekeeping, who worked at Hexham Abbey. But they didn't last long with Betty. She gave them up quickly to the Museum of Antiquities at Newcastle University to study. The academics at Newcastle who saw the heads, Roger Mickett and David Smith, just thought they were some old stones and made no claims about any supernatural events. Being no use to them, they also passed them on, and this is where it takes another drastic turn. The heads eventually made their way to Dr. Anne Ross, who had a deep interest in relics and was known for her work in studying ancient pagan traditions. She took the artifacts into her home to examine them, and at first she had no reason to suspect that the two small stone heads would lead to anything beyond an academic curiosity. But almost immediately as the heads were placed into her home, an unmistakable darkness seemed to descend upon her family. The quiet, comfortable atmosphere of her household was soon replaced by strange, inexplicable events, small at first, but gradually becoming more intense and disturbing. Dr. Ross was no stranger to folklore and legends, having spent much of her career researching ancient Celtic myths and practices. Yet, nothing in her vast academic background could have prepared her for the terrifying encounters that would unfold in the following weeks. Over the next few months, Dr. Ross's family was seeing dark figures all around the house, sometimes in a form of a dark black mass, but at times it would kind of solidifying to something else. Now that would be absolutely terrifying. What on earth is going on? Isn't it a strange coincidence that these things happened after she brought these heads home? Was it all mind games? They've heard these stories from the previous families that were inside that semi-detached house, and they are now thinking that they might be seeing things? Or is it real? Are they seeing these weird things as well? And as mentioned, it wasn't just Dr. Ross, it was her family. So, late one evening, while resting in her bed, she woke to a cold chill in the room. At first, of course, she just thought it was the usual draft. But as she opened her eyes, she was struck by the sheer malevolence of the presence in the room. At the foot of her bed stood a monstrous figure, partially human and partially animal. Its eyes, glowing an intense amber, shone like twin orbs in the darkness. Its fur was thick and dark, its body broad and hunched, with claws that seemed to glisten in the dim light. Dr. Ross described the creature's eyes as the most terrifying aspect. They seemed almost otherworldly, shining an unnatural predatory intelligence. I mean, yeah, if you're seeing some beast with thick dark fur, hunched over with claws and glowing eyes, I think I would probably guess that's otherworldly as well. Apparently, the creature remained motionless, staring at her with its gleaming eyes, as though it was waiting for something, or even perhaps savouring her terror. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the beast vanished, leaving the room dissolving itself into the shadows. Despite Dr. Ross's fear, she jumped up. She tried to follow it so far, but was scared to go right after it, and it vanished after going downstairs towards the kitchen. She woke her husband up and they both searched for the beast in the house, but there was no sign of it anywhere. Could it have been a dream? A product of her exhaustion? Or was something far more sinister at work? Well, only a few days after that, Dr. Ross's daughter, Bernice, then aged 15, came home from school one day at 4 p.m, with her parents returning from work 2 hours later at 6 p.m. When they returned, they found her in a state of shock, pale and frightened. Eventually, Dr. Ross got Bernice to tell her what's the matter, what had happened while they'd been gone.
She had opened the front door with a key, and as she opened it, a black thing, which she described as being as near a werewolf as anything that, she could imagine, had leapt halfway down the stairs, had jumped over the banisters, and landed with a kind of plop, like padded heavy animal feet. And it had rushed towards the back of the house, and she had felt compelled to follow it. And it disappeared in the music room right at the end of the corridor. And when she got there, it had gone, and then she realised she was terrified.
Another time, it said Bernice encountered the werewolf again as she was taking her ill father some food up to his bedroom. The beast was stood, looking at her on the stairs, seemingly blocking her way. Oh my god. How absolutely terrifying would that be? I'm pretty sure I would drop the tray of food and run the hell away. I mean, a 15-year-old girl encountering a werewolf on the stairs blocking her path. That sounds absolutely wild. In later years, even Dr. Ross's son came forward and said that he had seen the werewolf too. Like with Ellen Dodd, the creature stood in the doorway of his bedroom trying to reach for him. But this time, it was not a were-sheep like Ellen had seen. It was definitely the werewolf as described by his family. So that is pretty strange. Was there two beasts? I mean, it might make sense, there's two heads. Or was Ellen just being mistaken as she was kind of half asleep? Did she think this beast was kind of sheep-looking, but it was actually the werewolf that the other family had been seeing? So, despite her initial skepticism, Dr. Ross began to wonder if the Hexham Heads had anything to do with the nightmarish encounters her family were having. She had spent her career studying ancient belief systems as well as folklore, and began to suspect that the Hexham Heads were linked to something older and darker than a mere archaeological curiosity. Some theories suggested that the heads were cursed relics, possibly tied to ancient rituals. Others believed they acted as spirit vessels, channeling this entity. Perhaps a Celtic guardian spirit, or even a werewolf-like being from pre-Christian mythology. Of course, after these terrifying events, Dr. Ross gave up the heads, and she said,
"The day that the heads were removed from the house, everybody, including my husband, said it's as if a cloud had lifted, and since then there hasn't been really a trace of it."
They then ended up in the care of a guy called Don Robbins, as he became convinced that the Hexham Heads could help him prove the stone tape theory. And I often see people laughing about this stone tape theory, but I actually really like it. And I'm going to dive into it more in a separate video, so make sure you check that out. But the theory goes that ghosts or hauntings could happen when the energy from a death was so powerful it could have burnt itself into the brick or stone itself. Just like old cassette tapes being lined with iron oxide and a silica film strip to record sound. Could some stone that has the same specific ingredients be able to capture recordings? Could these Hexham Heads hold some valuable information, or perhaps even something else? After all, at some point in history, if you explained cassette tapes to them, they would have thought you were some kind of witch. That's impossible. How could you record sound? Robbins was a practical, down-to-earth man. At first, he had dismissed the rumours as local superstition, nothing more than a folklore-like tale passed down through generations. However, when he began to experience strange activity, His skepticism, of course, quickly turned into fear. Although, to be honest, looking at his reports of what this strange activity was, it seems to me that he was putting any old daily troubles, such as car failure, down as paranormal, and connecting anything he could to these mysterious heads. And that is the problem when you've got something like this with the stories that surround it. You might hear a bump in the night which could have been any old bump before. You might not have even noticed it, but now that these strange things with apparent hauntings happening around them are in your house, you're going to put that knock down to these being in your house. Plus, it makes sense to me that he wanted to get in on this story and experience and tale that was going around at this time. As remember, he was studying the stone tape theory, and this being a hot topic, maybe he's seen an opportunity to latch onto them. He went on to write a book with one of the heads even featuring on the cover. So that theory to me kind of makes sense. And I was going to try and get hold of one of those books to see what it was all talking about. And of course they were written a long time ago. Maybe they're hard to get hold of now, because if you look for the book you will find it, but at absolutely insane prices. I am not going to be spending that much money on that book. And this is the funny thing as well. Once he had written his book, he was done with them. No use to him anymore. So he passed the stone heads onto an astrologer called Frank Hyde, who wanted to experiment with them. And a lot of people say that this guy was some kind of medium. So those thoughts come into play as well. Right, one of those guys getting in on the hauntings. But after looking at many stories online, I think I've kind of debunked the medium story. I don't think he was one. From what I've found, I think the story of him just being an astrologer was correct. But unfortunately, after Frank Hyde had them, they have never been seen since. Until now. No. Of course, I'm not going to be getting any hauntings because these are in my house. As mentioned earlier, they're just 3D prints. But I am pretty proud of how they've turned out. So anyway, while all of this was going on, the mystery surrounding the Hexham Heads sparked a range of theories, from paranormal explanations to more rational, grounded ones. Skeptics, of course, have always questioned the validity of the claims associated with the heads, suggesting that the strange occurrences may have been the result of heightened imagination, folklore, or simple coincidence. And yes, despite these attempts to rationalize the events, the bizarre phenomena and the appearance of a werewolf and even maybe that were-sheep continued to fuel speculation. Just imagine if this was actually real and those two creatures were actually seen. What do you think is going on? As mentioned earlier, are those two entities somehow attached to these two stone heads? Digging these heads up has somehow released the entities back into the world? It's a crazy thought. One theory that makes more sense is that it's all just part of a hoax. It's just a prank. A local man named Desmond Craigie came forward in the late 70s. He said that he had been laughing his head off throughout all of this that was going on in the news, in the newspapers, because as a young lad, he said he had made the heads. Craigie's revelation raised eyebrows, and many saw that as the final piece of the puzzle, a concrete explanation of the origins of the heads. According to Craigie, he crafted the heads as part of a school project or a personal endeavour during his youth, using a form of concrete that, over time, had weathered and taken on the appearance of stone. For many, this was the smoking gun they had been waiting for. If Craigie had indeed created the heads, it would explain their peculiar appearance and why they seemed so out of place in the context of ancient history. It was a relief to those who wanted a more mundane answer to the mystery, one grounded in reality, not in paranormal speculation. However though, when skeptics asked him to reproduce the exact same designs as the heads that had been unearthed in the Robson family's garden, Craigie found the task far more difficult than he had anticipated, and all of his attempts fell short. His inability to reproduce the heads left many people questioning the truth of his story. I mean, I'm not surprised, but for some, this raised more questions than answers. How could a young man have created such unusual and lifelike carvings so many years ago, only to be unable to replicate them many years later? Some suggested that Craigie's story was just a fabrication, similar to the Robbins theory, an attempt to gain notoriety, or more wild theories suggested that he was trying to deflect any attention away from something far more mysterious. That's right, there were even theories going around that these entities were possessing him, trying to use him to distract people of the real story. The failure to replicate the objects fueled further speculation of their true origins. Could it be that the Hexham Heads were crafted by someone, or something else entirely? Some researchers pointed to the fact that the heads, regardless of their origin, were found in a place of historical and mystical significance. Hexham, like many other ancient sites in Britain, has a long history of folklore, myths and legends about supernatural forces. Perhaps the heads were part of a forgotten tradition, tied to the ancient beliefs of the Celts or other indigenous peoples, and their true purpose could not be understood by modern minds. Even if Desmond Craigie's claim that he created the Hexham Heads as a teenager was true, it doesn't fully explain the bizarre and terrifying events that followed. The strange phenomena, the unexplained movements of the heads, the eerie sounds, the cold chills, and the unsettling shadowy figures that continued to plague the families and others who came into contact with the heads. Even if the heads weren't connected to ancient artifacts, they seemed to act as a catalyst for something far more sinister. The ongoing sightings of the werewolf-like creature, coupled with the terrifying poltergeist activity, raised the question, could the heads have triggered some kind of dominant force? Were they somehow tied to a curse or even to the land itself? The events experienced by the families involved seemed to suggest that there was something beyond mere coincidence or human fabrication at play. Personally, I think he made them. It's been proven that he did in fact live in that same house in the 1950s. I think that's the reason why he couldn't replicate the heads in the 70s, because they had been underground for 20 odd years. I don't think he's going to be able to recreate the weathering that these things had gained. Now the thing is, Desmond Craigie also claimed that he had made 3, but 1 must be still lost in the garden. Now wow, imagine if we could dig up this garden and find the 3rd head. That would probably debunk any stories around these heads and prove his claims correct. As long, of course, as you could determine that the stones were made of the same material, from the same time period, maybe even with more weathering, because obviously it's even more time that the 3rd one would have been underground by now. But to be honest, besides that, all of those paranormal experiences, I mean, wow, pretty damn crazy. What would you guys do if you had seen shadowy figures, sometimes forming into solidified werewolf-like creatures? And if the lady's story of the were-sheep is true, what would you do if you seen a were-sheep? Give it a little pat on its head or get the hell out of there? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. And as I mentioned at the start about possibly winning these 2 Hexham Head replicas that I've made, even if you've already left a comment, if you've got to this point, go into the comments and just comment were-sheep, and I will go through everyone who has commented were-sheep and pick a winner. That's even if you would like these strange Hexham Heads to begin with. Once I've chosen a winner, I'll make a community post and at you, and I will get your details and pass these heads over. So thank you so much for watching, everybody. I appreciate it, and if you've actually got to the end of this story, you're an absolute legend. That is the thing with making longer content. When I do 5 minutes or 10-minute videos, people say they want longer content, but when I actually look at the videos, no matter how long the content is, people seem to always drop off halfway anyway. So it's obviously just the absolute legends who are asking for longer content because you guys stick around and watch the full things. And I'm going to know who by your commenting weresheep. So hopefully you've liked that more chilled out, longer video, no quick cut edits to get it out there. And I'm going to be doing more of these guys. I've actually been diving into some crazy stories that I think you will have not heard yet. Some even about some very famous people that everyone tells the same stories. And I'm going to tell those as well and give my take on them. But I want to bring you things that you haven't heard as well. So hopefully I can see you there. That would mean a lot. I appreciate that, and I will see you in the next one.